Welcome to the Diverse Minds podcast, where we give you the tips, tools, and techniques you need to be a mentally healthy and inclusive leader. Each week, you'll hear about a variety of topics linked to mental health, well-being, and diversity that will enhance both your professional practice and personal well-being. Welcome to the 110th episode of the award-winning Diverse Minds podcast. And it's Black History Month, one of my favourite times of the year. This month, I'm dedicating the podcast to valuing the variety of Black experiences and how to have a BHM 365 approach. And on today's episode, I'm going to be talking about calling out anti-Blackness in South Asian communities. I wanted to talk about this as it's deeply uncomfortable and a topic that needs to be addressed, and saying it actually makes me feel very sick. But it has to be acknowledged and it has to be talked about in order for things to change. And it's tragic and it makes me very, very angry. In this context, Black is to define Black British people who are descended from the historical African diaspora to the Americas and the Caribbean, as well as more recent migration from the continent of Africa, South America, Caribbean, and Europe. Anti-Blackness, and this is a definition I've adapted from University College Irvine, California, says that anti-Blackness refers to actions or behaviors that minimize, marginalize, or devalue the full participation of Black citizens in the UK and beyond. The spectrum of anti-Black actions and behaviors spans from microaggressions and biases to motivated acts of prejudice. They include the tolerance or indifference to the underrepresentation, differential success, and advancement or experiences of Black people in society. And for me, that last part is where I often see the South Asian anti-Blackness. That the impact of anti-Blackness is aggravated by intersectional dimensions of diversity, which will include class, disability, immigration status, sexual orientation, etc. And acts of anti-Blackness may not always be maliciously motivated, but there can be this element of superiority. And it's the ways in which policies, procedures, and practices are created and invoked that robs Black citizens of their participation and sense of belonging. The accumulated negative impacts of this, as well as individual acts of racism and the ongoing legacies of both colonialism and slavery, create an experience that other global majority groups are unlikely to encounter in the same way, and this is key. If you care about racism, we all have to, but particularly us from South Asian communities, we have to care about anti-Blackness specifically. There are specific things to focus on in relation to the South Asian community. And I also want to be clear and say that this isn't every single South Asian person, of course. As with most things, there's a spectrum, and many South Asian families I know have fought hard for solidarity. And in a Galdam article published in March 2021, Saffron East gives more information about the history of solidarity. And I'm going to read 2 paragraphs from this article because I think it really puts the solidarity part into context. It's super helpful. And I've included a link to the show notes so you can read the full piece, which really is excellent and incredibly illuminating. So Saffron says, as long as Black and South Asian people have been in Britain, there has been some sort of united anti-racist activism. During the majority of the 20th century, global majority people were explicitly treated like an underclass in housing, leisure, and in the workplace. This was a common shared experience. And by the 1960s, Black and Asian workers and service provisions organizations forged networks of solidarity. The Black People's Alliance, the BPA, for example, was a politically Black coalition of South Asian and Caribbean migrant organizations spearheaded by an Indian migrant, Jagmohan Joshi. BPA came together at a time when Black with a capital B meant all non-white immigrants to Britain from newly independent states or those that were still colonized. They protested against racist immigration laws and forged solidarities in the face of racist trade unions. And if anyone's interested, there's a really great piece on this with the Imperial Typewriter Strike as one example. I know that there are lots where unions didn't take up the cases of Black and Asian and Southeast Asian workers, so they were really on their own and having to come together, and within the community, people were trying to pay for each other because they didn't get strike pay. Since then, there have been many more anti-racist activists who have organized as politically Black, such as Southall Black Sisters. And if you don't know who they are absolutely phenomenal, so do check them out. And Asian youth movements. In the 1970s and 1980s, these young South Asian women and men organized with Black young people under the Black political banner, fighting against racism in the police, as well as continuing the work of their predecessors. SBS, which is Southall Black Sisters, evolved into a domestic violence support charity, and like Sister Space, it continues to support domestic violence victims and survivors who are unable to seek state or local authority provisions due to structural racism, although in recent years they have allied with transphobic organisations like Women's Place UK. Striking groups of Asian and Black workers in places like Preston and Bristol, this work helped usher in the 1965 Race Relations Act. So there is a history there. And when I'm talking about this, I'm not accusing everyone of having anti-Black tendencies, but there's certain things that we absolutely need to talk about. And I think understanding that history and that solidarity is one of the key areas. Now, of course, we often talk about white privilege and what white privilege means, but we can also have global majority privilege. And I think particularly we see it with many South Asian communities, depending on their caste, their diaspora journey. If caste is still a big factor, religion, there are lots of things that will play into this privilege. So it may not necessarily be the same as that as white privilege, because usually, particularly in the West, it's still white dominant norms and culture. Those class elements based on wealth, religion, and status have been decided and shaped by colonialism, and they've played a huge part in this privilege and this privilege hierarchy within the South Asian communities. And I think there is often a willingness to turn a blind eye towards anti-Blackness. And when I was doing a bit of research, I found some lived experience articles by South Asian women in the US that talked about the fact that, in their families, there was very unhelpful and untrue rhetoric around, well, we work really hard and people from other communities don't, and they're this and they're that, and very negative derogatory words, and therefore we deserve it, we have worked much harder, which of course isn't true, because if we think about the systemic and the systems and who might have had a leg up in terms of the systemic side, it looks quite different. There is a lot of aligning with the dominant culture, and unfortunately we see that a lot with politics today. I don't think I need to mention any names, and what that looks like, and what I call Ji Sahib culture, which means yes sir, and just willing to be the nodding dog, if you like, to go along with it for power, for an easy life, and to not challenge things. And in some cases, there'll be inherited money, businesses, homes, etc., from being lighter skinned during colonialism. People who are dual heritage, there's an interesting history around Anglo-Indians, for example, that can create a lot of privilege. Less likely to be stopped by police, particularly South Asian women. But I know that Bengali and Pakistani young men, particularly who are Muslim, are much more likely to be stopped than the female counterparts. But so there is, it's a very different experience to being a Black male in terms of stop and search. And this whole idea of the model minority, get your head down, shut up, you're working hard, you're not going to question anything. And this perception that if we just stay quiet, it'll be okay. And that actually that's the way to get ahead. But in the words of Audre Lorde, your silence will not protect you. And I think recently there have been some fantastic stories and people coming out talking about this. Many have been around marriage, but some of you might have seen Amit Patel and his wife Michelle. Amit is British Indian heritage and his wife Michelle is British Ghanaian, and they met at school when they were 13. It's really beautiful. They've got some lovely photos, and they kept their relationship a secret for years because he feared his family's reaction. And he says that racist attitudes about Black people in his community are influenced by colorism and the caste system in some South Asian countries. And if you want to know more about colorism, please check out episode 103, which is all about the damaging impacts of colorism and shadism. But the happy story is they did get married, and they have a brilliant YouTube channel with 26,000 followers. So please check it out. And they have the hashtag India meets Ghana, which even saying it really makes me smile. And in this same piece, and I've included a link in the show notes, the BBC, it's a Newsbeat piece, and there's also a video. Rapper Raj Forever, he talks about his Jamaican and Sri Lankan heritage and how he was made to feel like a real outsider in his Asian community. And again, really worth watching, and the offensive slurs used to describe Black communities and Black people. And again, the history around colorism and shadism, it has been in situ for centuries, being driven by the caste system and colonization. And there has been a history as well for South Asians to prove their proximity to whiteness. So some of you might be familiar that certain groups in America had to go to court to prove their whiteness. So a lot of Indians tried to do this, apparently in the 1920s, to gain entrance into areas that should be considered white for the purposes of immigration. And this idea of whiteness and whiteness being rightness continues to live on. So I really hope you're enjoying the content of this podcast. And if you want to keep up to date, then why not join my bi-monthly newsletter? If you join, you'll receive a free copy of my ebook, The Mentally Healthy Leading Manager. And if you want to do that, please go to bit.ly/MHLMEBKLNK. And the link is also in the show notes. Okay, so I've given an overview of anti-Blackness and what it might look like, specifically in some South Asian communities. But what can we actually do to change this? And are there ways in which we can really shape this or change this or do things differently? I think one of the things is that it's tackling what it is that stops people engaging with the conversation. And I think discomfort might be some of it, but I feel that there is a sense of, well, I'm all right, so best not rock the boat. I'm not Black, so what's it got to do with me? I'll let that sit over there because I've got my own stuff, or I don't have my own stuff and I don't want to get involved. There can be this ingrained superiority complex around, well, we're really different, and believing all the biological nonsense around race that was developed in the 1800s by white Victorian men. And I think because that message has been permeated through colonization and occupation, that sometimes sits in people's brains. The systemic advantages given to South Asians over other groups, and therefore the inequity that exists. But some questions you might want to think about. And one thing I think is really tough is having these conversations with family. I think often in the workplace, it's much easier because we have policies, we have procedures, we have frameworks, we have schemes. There is a professional code of conduct usually. If you break it, there are consequences, hopefully, usually. But in families, unless someone wants to tell me otherwise, I think it's very unusual that anyone sits down and says, right, what's our family health and safety policy? What's our family communications policy? What's our family grievance policy? So having these conversations can be really difficult. And often we don't really know what someone's thinking because it may come out in a different way, in a way that we haven't expected. I think the other key thing is in the various many South Asian languages, being racist in English can have it can be clearer, and the words are very powerful. Sometimes in the other languages that we speak, the South Asian languages that we speak, maybe we let it go because it doesn't sound as offensive to us. It's not as the history of those words aren't quite the same as the history of English words in terms of slavery, colonialism, and occupation. And some of them might be, maybe we don't know the history of them, but does it make it sound less offensive somehow in the various languages that we speak? And how do we then call that out and say, you know what? I don't think this word is fit for purpose anymore. There will be other words that we can use. Let's not use this word anymore. And you might get pushback and you might get, well, what's the problem? You're getting so sensitive. And then maybe the compromise is, well, just don't use it in front of me. Let's use this word if we're going to talk about these subjects. Does this mean that when we hear these words, we're less likely to challenge it? And also thinking about, well, does hearing things in another language make it easier for us to join in? And I think one of the biggest challenges is, how do we challenge this in a context of respect for our elders? And I don't think you will get someone to do a complete 360 if they have been used to talking about it in a particular way, or not being ready to challenge racism, or finding it uncomfortable, or potentially I think actually it's not always about finding it uncomfortable. I think it's a case of, well, it's always been this way. So I wanted to share with you the CROP model. And this is a framework, a conversation framework for managing conflict in a collaborative way. And I think it's really useful when you're trying to influence sideways or upwards and in a family conversation. So it's actually designed to make a conversation productive and positive. You can also use it as planning your approach, as well as a framework for the actual conversation. And remember that these things are really easy to explain. And when they're emotions, when your heart's beating, when there's something you really care about in a context that maybe the rules aren't as clear as they are in a work context, that can be really, really difficult. But I think the first thing is to think about the common goal. So what is the common goal? Why is it important that people stop using this language, or that we stop, to stop anti-Blackness, and to maybe talk about and unpick someone's lived experience of racism or what happened? It's highly unlikely that someone's had zero experience of racism at some point in their life, particularly if they're in the West. So maybe the bigger goal is to have empathy, to understand each other. What's something that you want to agree on? And then the reality. So this is about checking two-way exploration towards a shared understanding. So maybe this is a way to come together and talk about lived experiences of racism and how it might feel for other people as well from different communities. And maybe that will start to have a light bulb moment. If we're feeling like this and we've had this lived experience, how do we think people from other communities might have experienced this? And that can be a really nice way of talking about it and storytelling. And it has a different flavor as opposed to, right, we need to stop this straight away, which of course it does need to happen and it might be our gut reaction, but how helpful is that in the grand scheme of things? And then the third bit is options. So exploring ways to meet common goals within your shared reality and asking them about options. So what do you think we could do differently? Or how do you think we could understand other communities' experiences of racism? Or when we use these words, even though it's just a family and no one from the outside can hear us, what does that actually say about us and what we've just talked about and our lived experience of racism? And then P is the plan. So pick the best way forward. And I think it can be small things. I think it can be, should we agree not to use these words anymore? Should we agree that we will aim to understand? Should we agree that we're going to have these conversations more? Now, this, of course, I haven't got someone in front of me, so it can feel a bit stilted, but I think that this can be a way of starting to call it out. And I think it can be very frustrating for us to not understand why people in our own families don't see the world that we do. But as I get older, I do sense that there are lots of generational differences, and I'm not justifying that at all, but we need to make space for understanding and that things have moved on and that language changes. And this is actually not helpful for anyone. So if we care about being treated badly and our own lived experiences of racism through the generations and not being forced to assimilate to white dominant cultural norms, we owe it to ourselves to be part of solidarity movements and know that there won't be equality for us unless there is equity, freedom, and inclusion for all Black communities. And we mustn't buy into this scarcity myth that if we put our heads above the parapet, if we join in, there'll be less for us and they'll take over, for example. And please excuse my language there, I don't think that, but I've heard these things being said. And this is part of the divisive nature of racism, to push people apart so there isn't that solidarity. So we mustn't be afraid to stick our heads above what we perceive to be the parapet, because remember the phrase, your silence won't protect you. I really hope you do access the resources I've shared. So I've got Rejecting Political Blackness Isn't an Excuse to Erase Solidarity Between South Asian and Black Communities. That's a Galdem article I mentioned earlier. The Brown Hijabi, Sahaima Mansour's resource list for South Asian communities, the link to South Asian anti-Black racism, We Don't Marry Black People, so that's Amit and Michelle's story, and the India Meets Ghana on YouTube. A very insightful piece called Kamala Auntie Prompts Examination of Anti-Blackness for South Asians, based on the election of Kamala Harris, of course, who's dual heritage. An opinion piece, South Asians have been complicit in anti-Blackness for too long, and British South Asians speak out about anti-Black racism within their communities. I mean, of course, I'm saddened, but I'm so pleased to see that this has become more of a topic of conversation and acknowledging what's going on. So really, again, please, if you found this useful, please leave me a review on Apple Podcasts or wherever you listen to your podcast from, and you can leave a review. And I really hope you've enjoyed the show. And don't miss next week's episode. I'm talking to Nina Kuipers about Black menopause. So until then, everyone, take care, stay strong, and much solidarity to you.
Thanks for listening to the Diverse Minds podcast. Don't forget to subscribe on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or wherever you access your podcasts from. You can also connect with me on Facebook, Twitter, and LinkedIn. Tune into next week's episode of the podcast, where I'll bring you more insights on mental health and inclusion. Bye for now.